Popular Government. Sir Henry Sumner Maine. 1885. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. Essay 2. The Nature of Democracy. John Austin, a name honored in the annals of English jurisprudence, published shortly before his death a pamphlet called A Plea for the Constitution. In this publication, which marks the farthest rebound of a powerful mind from the peculiar philosophical radicalism of the immediate pupils of Jeremy Bentham, Austin applies the analytical power, on which his fame rests, to a number of expressions which entered in his day, as they do in ours, into every political discussion. Among them, he examines the terms aristocracy and democracy, and of the latter he says, democracy is still more ambiguous than aristocracy. It signifies properly a form of government, that is, any government in which the governing body is a comparatively large fraction of the entire nation. As used loosely, and particularly by French writers, it signifies the body of the nation, or the lower part of the nation, or a way of thinking and feeling favorable to democratical government. It not infrequently bears the meaning which is often given to the word people, or the word sovereign people, that is, some large portion of the nation which is not actually sovereign, but to which, in the opinion of the speaker, the sovereignty ought to be transferred. The same definition of democracy, in its only proper and consistent sense, is given by M. Edmund Scherer, in his powerful and widely circulated pamphlet, named La Démocratique et la France. I shall have to refer presently to M. Scherer's account of the methods by which the existing French political system is made to discharge the duties of government, but, meantime, the greatest merit of his publication does not seem to me to lie in its exposure of the servility of the deputies to the electoral committees, or of the public extravagance by which their support is purchased. It lies rather in M. Scherer's examination of certain vague abstract propositions, which are commonly accepted without question by the Republican politicians of France, and indeed of the whole continent. In our day, when the extension of popular government is throwing all the older political ideas into utter confusion, a man of ability can hardly render a higher service to his country than by the analysis and correction of the assumptions which pass from mind to mind in the multitude, without inspiring a doubt of their truth and genuineness. Some part of this intellectual circulating medium was base from the first, another was once good coin, but it is clipped and worn on all sides, another consists of mere tokens, which are called by an old name, because there is a conventional understanding that it shall still be used. It is urgently necessary to rate all this currency at its true value, and, as regards a part of it, this was done once for all by Sir J. F. Stephen, in his admirable volume on liberty, fraternity, and equality. But the political smashers are constantly at work, and their dupes are perpetually multiplying, while there is by no means a corresponding activity in applying the proper test to all this spurious manufacture. We Englishmen pass on the continent as masters of the art of government, yet it may be doubted whether, even among us, the science, which corresponds to the art, is not very much in the condition of political economy before Adam Smith took it in hand. In France the condition of political thought is even worse. Englishmen abandon a political dogma when it has led to practical disaster. But it has been the lot of Frenchmen to have their attention fastened on the last 11 years of the last century and on the first 15 of the present, almost to the exclusion of the rest of their story, and the political ideas which grew up during this period have hardly relaxed their hold on the French intellect at all, after 70 years of further experience. M. Scherer, so far as my knowledge extends, has been the first French writer to bring into clear light the simple truth stated by Austin, that democracy means properly a particular form of government. This truth, in modern continental politics, is the beginning of wisdom. There is no word about which a denser mist of vague language, and a larger heap of loose metaphors, has collected. Yet, although democracy does signify something indeterminate, there is nothing vague about it. It is simply and solely a form of government. It is the government of the state by the many, as opposed, according to the old Greek analysis, to its government by the few, and to its government by one. The border between the few and the many, and again between the varieties of the many, is necessarily indeterminate, but democracy not the less remains a mere form of government, and, inasmuch as of these forms the most definite and determinate is monarchy, the government of the state. By one person democracy is most accurately described as inverted monarchy. And this description answers to the actual historical process by which the great modern republics have been formed. Hillary has shown that the modern state of the continental type, with distinctly denned administrative departments as its organs, was first constituted in Italy. It grew, not out of the medieval republican municipalities, which had nothing in common with modern government, but out of that most ill-famed of all political systems, the Italian tyranny or princedom. The celebrated Italian statecraft, spread all over Europe by Italian statesmen, who were generally ecclesiastics, was applied to France by Louis XIV. And Colbert, the pupils of Cardinal Mazarin, And out of the contact of this new science with an administrative system in complete disorder, there sprang monarchical France. The successive French republics have been nothing but the later French monarchy, upside down. Similarly, the constitutions and the legal systems of the several North American states, and of the United States, would be wholly unintelligible to anybody who did not know that the ancestors of the Anglo-Americans had once lived under a king, himself the representative of older kings infinitely more autocratic, and who had not observed that throughout these bodies of law and plans of government the people had simply been put into the king's seat, occasionally filling it with some awkwardness. The advanced radical politician of our day would seem to have an impression that democracy differs from monarchy in essence. There can be no grosser mistake than this, and none more fertile of further delusions. Democracy, the government of the Commonwealth by a numerous but indeterminate portion of the community taking the place of the monarch, has exactly the same conditions to satisfy as monarchy. It has the same functions to discharge, though it discharges them through different organs. The tests of success in the performance of the necessary and natural duties of a government are precisely the same in both cases. Thus, in the very first place, democracy, like monarchy, like aristocracy, like any other government, must preserve the national existence. The first necessity of a state is that it should be durable. Among mankind regarded as assemblages of individuals, the gods are said to love those who die young, but nobody has ventured to make such an assertion of states. The prayers of nations to heaven have been, from the earliest ages, for long national life, life from generation to generation, life prolonged far beyond that of children's children, life like that of the everlasting hills. The historian will sometimes speak of governments distinguished for the loftiness of their aims, and the brilliancy of the talents which they called forth, but doomed to an existence all too brief. The compliment is in reality a paradox, for in matters of government all objects are vain and all talents wasted, when they fail to secure national durability. One might as well eulogize a physician for the assiduity of his attendance and the scientific beauty of his treatment, when the patient has died under his care. Next perhaps to the paramount duty of maintaining national existence, comes the obligation incumbent on democracies, as on all governments, of securing the national greatness and dignity. Loss of territory, loss of authority, loss of general respect, loss of self-respect, may be unavoidable evils, but they are terrible evils, judged by the pains they inflict and the elevation of the minds by which these pains are felt, and the government which fails to provide a sufficient supply of generals and statesmen, of soldiers and administrators, for the prevention and cure of these evils, is a government which has miscarried. It will also have miscarried, if it cannot command certain qualities which are essential to the success of national action. In all their relations with one another, and this is a fundamental assumption of international law, states must act as individual men. The defects which are defects in individual men, and perhaps venial defects, are faults in states, and generally faults of the extremest gravity. In all war and all diplomacy, in every part of foreign policy, caprice, willfulness, loss of self-command, timidity, temerity, inconsistency, indecency, and coarseness, are weaknesses which rise to the level of destructive vices, and if democracy is more liable to them than are other forms of government, it is to that extent inferior to them. It is better for a nation, according to an English prelate, to be free than to be sober. If the choice has to be made, and if there is any real connection between democracy and liberty, it is better to remain a nation capable of displaying the virtues of a nation than even to be free. If we turn from the foreign to the domestic duties of a nation, we shall find the greatest of them to be, that its government should compel obedience to the law, criminal and civil. The vulgar impression no doubt is, that laws enforce themselves. Some communities are supposed to be naturally law-abiding, and some are not. But the truth is, and this is a commonplace of the modern jurist, that it is always the state which causes laws to be obeyed. It is quite true that this obedience is rendered by the great bulk of all civilized societies without an effort and quite unconsciously. But that is only because, in the course of countless ages, the stern discharge of their chief duty by states has created habits and sentiments which save the necessity for penal interference, because nearly everybody shares them. The venerable legal formulas, which make laws to be administered in the name of the king, formulas which modern republics have borrowed, are a monument of the grandest service which governments have rendered, and continue to render, to mankind. If any government should be tempted to neglect, even for a moment, its function of compelling obedience to law, if a democracy, for example, were to allow a portion of the multitude of which it consists to set some law at defiance which it happens to dislike, it would be guilty of a crime which hardly any other virtue could redeem, and which century upon century might fail to repair. On the whole, the dispassionate student of politics, who has once got into his head that democracy is only a form of government, who has some idea of what the primary duties of government are, and who sees the main question, in choosing between them, to be which of them in the long run best discharges these duties, has a right to be somewhat surprised at the feelings which the advent of democracy excites. The problem which this event, if it be near at hand, suggests, is not sentimental but practical, and one might have expected less malediction on one side, and less shouting and throwing up of caps on the other. The fact, however, is that, when the current of human political tastes, which in the long course of ages has been running in all sorts of directions, sets strongly towards one particular point, there is always an outburst of terror or enthusiasm, and the explanation of the feelings roused on such occasions, which is true for our day and of a tendency towards democracy, is probably true also for all time. The great virtue of democracies in some men's eyes, their great vice in the eyes of others, is that they are thought to be more active than other forms of government in the discharge of one particular function. This is the alteration and transformation of law and custom, the process known to us as reforming legislation. As a matter of fact, this process, which is an indispensable, though in the long run a very subordinate, province of a good modern government, is not at all peculiar to democracies. If the whole of the known history of the human race be examined, we shall see that the great authors of legislative change have been powerful monarchies. The long wail at the iniquities of Nineveh and Babylon, which runs through the latter part of the Old Testament, is the expression of Jewish resentment at the big legislation with which the nations that most study the Old Testament are supposed to have fallen in love. The trituration of old usage was carried infinitely further by the Roman emperors, ever increasing in thoroughness as the despotism grew more stringent. The emperor was in fact the symbolic beast which the prophet saw devouring, breaking to pieces and stamping the residue with its feet. We ourselves live in the dust of Roman imperialism, and by far the largest part of modern law is nothing more than a sedimentary formation left by the Roman legal reforms. The rule holds good through all subsequent history. The one wholesale legal reformer of the Middle Ages was Charles the Great. It was the French Empire of the Bonapartes that gave real practical currency to the new French jurisprudence which has overrun the civilized world, for the governments immediately arising out of the Revolution left little behind them beyond projects of law or laws which were practically inapplicable from the contradictions which they contained. The truth seems to be that the extreme forms of government, monarchy and democracy, have a peculiarity which is absent from the more tempered political systems founded on compromise, constitutional kingship and aristocracy. When they are first established in absolute completeness, they are highly destructive. There is a general, sometimes chaotic, upheaval, while the nouvelle couches are settling into their place in the transformed commonwealth. The new rulers sternly insist that everything shall be brought into strict conformity with the central principle of the system over which they preside, and they are aided by numbers of persons to whom the old principles were hateful, from their fancy for ideal reforms, from impatience of a monotonous stability, or from a natural destructiveness of temperament. What the old monarchies, established in the valleys of the great eastern rivers, had to contend against was religious tenacity and tribal obstinacy, and they transported whole populations in order that these might be destroyed. What a modern democracy fights with is privilege, and it knows no rest till this is trampled out. But the legislation of absolutism, democratic or otherwise, is transitory. Before the Jews had taken home their harps from Babylon, they found themselves the subjects of another mighty conquering monarchy, of which they observed with wonder that the law of the Medes and Persians altereth not. There is no belief less warranted by actual experience, than that a democratic republic is, after the first and in the long run, given to reforming legislation. As is well known to scholars, the ancient republics hardly legislated at all, their democratic energy was expended upon war, diplomacy, and justice, but they put nearly insuperable obstacles in the way of a change of law. The Americans of the United States have hedged themselves round in exactly the same way. They only make laws within the limits of their constitutions, and especially of the federal constitution, and, judged by what has become the English standard, their legislation within these limits is almost trivial. As I attempted to show in my first essay, the legislative infertility of democracies springs from permanent causes. The prejudices of the people are far stronger than those of the privileged classes, they are far more vulgar, and they are far more dangerous, because they are apt to run counter to scientific conclusions. This assertion is curiously confirmed by the political phenomena of the moment. The most recent of democratic inventions is the referendum of the Swiss federal constitution, and of certain cantonal constitutions. On the demand of a certain number of citizens, a law voted by the legislature is put to the vote of the entire population, lest by any chance its mandate should have been exceeded. But to the confusion and dismay of the radical leaders in the legislature, the measures which they most prized, when so put, have been negatived. Democracy being what it is, the language used of it in our day, under its various disguises of freedom, the revolution, the republic, popular government, the reign of the people, is exceedingly remarkable. Every sort of metaphor, signifying irresistible force, and conveying admiration or dread, has been applied to it by its friends or its enemies. A great English orator once compared it to the grave, which takes everything and gives nothing back. The most widely read American historian altogether loses himself in figures of speech. The change which divine wisdom ordained, and which no human policy or force could hold back, proceeded as uniformly and majestically as the laws of being, and was as certain as the decrees of eternity. And again, the idea of freedom had never been wholly unknown. The rising light flashed joy across the darkest centuries, and its growing energy can be traced in the tendency of the ages. These hopes have even found room for themselves among the commonplaces of after-dinner oratory. The great tide of democracy is rolling on, and no hand can stay its majestic course, said Sir Wilfrid Lawson of the Franchise Bill. But the strongest evidence of the state of excitement into which some minds are thrown by an experiment in government, which is very old and has never been particularly successful, is afforded by a little volume with the title Towards Democracy. The writer is not destitute of poetical force, but the smallest conception of what democracy really is makes his rhapsodies about it astonishing. Freedom, sings this disciple of Walt Whitman. And among the far nations there is a stir like the stir of the leaves of the forest. Joy, joy, arising on earth. And lo! The banners lifted from point to point, and the spirits of the ancient races looking abroad, the divinely beautiful daughters of God calling to their children. Lo! The divine East from ages and ages back intact, her priceless jewel of thought, the germ of democracy bringing down. Glancing eyes. Leaping shining waters. Do I not know that thou, democracy, dost control and inspire, that thou too hast relations to them? As surely as Niagara has relations to Erie and Ontario? Towards the close of the poem this line occurs. I heard a voice say, "What is freedom?" It is impossible that the voice could ask a more pertinent question. If the author of Towards Democracy had ever heard the answer of Hobbes, that freedom is political power divided into small fragments, or the dictum of John Austin and M. Shearer, that democracy is a form of government, his poetical vein might have been drowned, but his mind would have been invigorated by the healthful douche of cold water. The opinion that democracy was irresistible and inevitable, and probably perpetual, would, only a century ago, have appeared a wild paradox. There had been more than 2,000 years of tolerably well-ascertained political history, and at its outset, monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy were all plainly discernible. The result of a long experience was, that some monarchies and some aristocracies had shown themselves extremely tenacious of life. The French monarchy and the Venetian oligarchy were in particular of great antiquity, and the Roman Empire was not even then quite dead. But the democracies which had risen and perished, or had fallen into extreme insignificance, seemed to show that this form of government was of rare occurrence in political history, and was characterized by an extreme fragility. This was the opinion of the fathers of the American Federal Republic, who over and over again betray their regret that the only government which it was possible for them to establish was one which promised so little stability. It became very shortly the opinion of the French revolutionists, for no sooner has the constitutional monarchy fallen than the belief that a new era has begun for the human race gives signs of rapidly fading, and the language of the revolutionary writers becomes stained with a dark and ever-growing suspiciousness, manifestly inspired by genuine fear that democracy must perish, unless saved by unflagging energy and unsparing severity. Nevertheless, the view that democracy is irresistible is of French origin, like almost all other sweeping political generalizations. It may be first detected about 50 years ago, and it was mainly spread over the world by the book of de Tocqueville on democracy in America. Some of the younger speculative minds in France were deeply struck by the revival of democratic ideas in France at the Revolution of 1830, and among them was Alexis de Tocqueville, born a noble and educated in Legitimism. The whole fabric of French revolutionary belief had apparently been ruined beyond hope of recovery, ruined by the crimes and usurpations of the Convention, by military habits and ideas, by the tyranny of Napoleon Bonaparte, by the return of the Bourbons with a large part of the system of the older monarchy, by the hard repression of the Holy Alliance. Yet so slight a provocation as the attempt of Charles X. to do what his brother had done without serious resistance, brought back the whole torrent of revolutionary sentiment and dogma, which at once overran the entire European continent. No doubt it seemed as if there were something in democracy which made it resistless, and yet, as M. Shearer has shown in one of the most valuable parts of his pamphlet, the Frenchmen of that idea did not mean the same thing as the modern French extremist or the English radical when they spoke of democracy. If their view be put affirmatively, they meant the ascendancy of the middle classes; if negatively, they meant the non-revival of the old feudal society. The French people were very long in shaking off their fear that the material advantages, secured to them by the First French Revolution, were not safe, and this fear it was which, as we perceive from the letters of Mallet du Pan, reconciled them to the tyranny of the Jacobins and caused them to look with the deepest suspicion on the plans of the sovereigns allied against the Republic. Democracy, however, gradually took a new sense, chiefly under the influence of wonder at the success of the American Federation, in which most of the states had now adopted universal suffrage, and by 1848 the word had come to be used very much with its ancient meaning, the government of the Commonwealth by the many. It is perhaps the scientific tinge which thought is assuming among us that causes so many Englishmen to take for granted that democracy is inevitable, because many considerable approaches to it have been made in our country. No doubt, if adequate causes are at work, the effect will always follow, but, in politics, the most powerful of all causes are the timidity, the listlessness, and the superficiality, of the generality of minds. If a large number of Englishmen, belonging to classes which are powerful if they exert themselves, continue saying to themselves and others that democracy is irresistible and must come, beyond all doubt it will come. The enthusiasm for democracy, which is conveyed by the figures of speech applied to it, is equally modern with the impression of its inevitableness. In reality, considering the brilliant stages in the history of a certain number of commonwealths with which democracy has been associated, nothing is more remarkable than the small amount of respect for it professed by actual observers, who had the opportunity and the capacity for forming a judgment on it. Mr. Grote did his best to explain away the poor opinion of the Athenian democracy entertained by the philosophers who filled the schools of Athens, but the fact remains that the founders of political philosophy found themselves in presence of democracy, in its pristine vigor, and thought it a bad form of government. The panegyrics of which it is now the object are, again, of French origin. They come to us from the oratory and literature of the First French Revolution, which, however, soon exchanged glorification of the new birth of the human race for a strain of gloomy suspicion and homicidal denunciation. The language of admiration which prevailed for a while had still remoter sources, and it may be observed, as an odd circumstance, that, while the Jacobins generally borrowed their phraseology from the legendary history of the early Roman Republic, the Girondins preferred resorting for metaphors to the literature which sprang from Rousseau. On the whole, I think that the historical ignorance which made heroes of Brutus and Scaevola was less abjectly nonsensical than the philosophical silliness which dwelt on the virtues of mankind in a state of natural democracy. If anybody wishes to know what was the influence of Rousseau in diffusing the belief in a golden age, when men lived, like brothers, in freedom and equality, he should read, not so much the writings of the sage, as the countless essays printed in France by his disciples just before 1789. They furnish very disagreeable proof that the intellectual flower of a cultivated nation may be brought, by fanatical admiration of a social and political theory, into a condition of downright mental imbecility. Footnote. Brissot, the Girondin leader, while still a young man and an enthusiastic royalist, had argued, long before Proudhon, that property is theft. There is, he said, a natural right to correct the injustice of the institution, by stealing. But he held the still more remarkable opinion, that cannibalism is natural and justifiable. Since, he argued, under the reign of nature the sheep does not spare the insects on the grass, and the wolf and the man eat the sheep, why have not all these creatures a natural right to eat creatures of their own kind? The language of the Jacobins and the language of the Girondins might be thought to have perished amid ridicule and disgust, but, in fact, it underwent a rehabilitation, like that which has fallen to the lot of Catiline, of Nero, and of Richard III. Tocqueville thought democracy was inevitable, but he looked on its approach with distrust and dread. In the course, however, of the succeeding 15 years 2 books were published, which, whatever their popularity, might fairly be compared with the writings of which we have spoken above, for a total abnegation of common sense. Louis Blanc took the homicidal pedant, Robespierre, for his hero, Lamartine, the feeble and ephemeral sect of Girondins, and from the works of these 2 writers has proceeded much the largest part of the language eulogistic of democracy, which pervades the humbler political literature of the continent, and now of Great Britain also. There is indeed one kind of praise which democracy has received, and continues to receive, in the greatest abundance. This is praise addressed to the governing demos by those who fear it, or desire to conciliate it, or hope to use it. When it has once become clear that democracy is a form of government, it will be easily understood what panegyrics of the multitude amount to. Democracy is monarchy inverted, and the modes of addressing the multitude are the same as the modes of addressing kings. The more powerful and jealous the sovereign, the more unbounded is the eulogy, the more extravagant is the tribute. King, live forever, was the ordinary formula of beginning an address to the Babylonian or Median king, drunk or sober. Your ascent to power proceeded as uniformly and majestically as the laws of being and was as certain as the decrees of eternity, says Mr. Bancroft to the American people. Such flattery proceeds frequently from the ignobler parts of human nature, but not always. What seems to us baseness, passed 200 years ago at Versailles for gentleness and courtliness, and many people have every day before them a monument of what was once thought suitable language to use of a king of England. In the dedication of the English Bible to James I, there is no reason to suppose that this generation will feel any particular shame at flattery, though the flattery will be addressed to the people and not to the king. It may even become commoner, through the growth of scientific modes of thought. Dean Church, in his recent volume on Bacon, has made the original remark that Bacon behaved himself to powerful men as he behaved himself to nature. Parendo Vensis. If you resist nature, she will crush you, but if you humor her, she will place her tremendous forces at your disposal. It is madness to offer direct resistance to a royal virago or a royal pedant, but by subservience you may command either of them. There is much of this feeling in the state of mind of intelligent and highly educated radicals, when they are in presence of a mob. They make their choice, according to the composition of their audience, between two wonderful alternative theories of our day: one, that the artisan of the towns knows everything, because his work is so monotonous, and because he has so much time on his hands; the other, that the laborer of the country districts knows everything, because his work is so various and his faculties so constantly active through this variety. Thus it comes to pass that an audience composed of roughs or clowns is boldly told by an educated man that it has more political information than an equal number of scholars. This is not the opinion of the speaker, but it may be made, he thinks, the opinion of the mob, and he knows that the mob could not act as if it were true, unless it worked through scholarly instruments. The best safeguard against the various delusions and extravagances which I have been examining is a little better knowledge of the true lines of movement which the political affairs of mankind have followed. In the opinion of a number of English gentlemen, whose authority is now somewhat on the decline, political history began in 1688. Mr. Bright seems to me to express himself often as if he thought that it began with the commencement of the anti-Corn Law agitation, and might be considered as having been practically arrested when the Corn Law was repealed in 1846. There are younger men who are persuaded that it commenced with a certain crisis in the municipal history of Birmingham. The truth, however, is, that we live in a day in which a strand is unwinding itself, which was steadily knitting itself up during long ages. It is difficult to imagine a more baseless historical generalization than that which Mr. Bancroft addresses to his American readers. During all the period when a change was proceeding which no human policy could hold back, the movement of political affairs, what Mr. Bancroft calls the tendency of the ages, was as distinctly towards monarchy as it now is towards democracy. Mankind appear to have begun that stage in their history, which is more or less visible to our eyes, with the germs in each society of all the three definite forms of government: monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. Everywhere the king and popular assembly are seen side by side, the first a priestly and judicial, but primarily a fighting, personage, the last sometimes under the control of an aristocratic senate, and itself varying from a small oligarchy to something like the entirety of the free male population. At the dawn of history, aristocracy seems to be gaining on monarchy, and democracy on aristocracy. And this passage of political development is especially well known to us through the accidents which have preserved to us a portion of the records of two famous societies, the Athenian Republic, the cradle of philosophy and art, and the Roman Republic, which began the conquests destined to embrace a great part of the world. This last republic was always more or less of an aristocracy, but from the time of its fall, and the establishment of the Roman Empire, there was on the whole, for 17 centuries, an all but universal movement towards kingship. There were, no doubt, evanescent revivals of popular government. The barbarian races, when they broke into the central Roman territory, brought with them very generally some amount of the ancient tribal liberty which, reintroduced into Mediterranean Europe, seemed again for a while likely to prove the seed of political freedom. The Roman municipal system, left to work unchecked within the walled cities of northern Italy, reproduced a form of democracy. But Italian commonwealths, and feudal estates and parliaments, all sank, with one memorable exception, before the ever-growing power and prestige of military despotic governments. The historian of our day is apt to moralize and lament over the change, but it was everywhere in the highest degree popular, and it called forth an enthusiasm quite as genuine as that of the modern radical for the coming democracy. The Roman Empire, the Italian tyrannies, the English Tudor monarchy, the French centralized kingship, the Napoleonic despotism, were all hailed with acclamation, most of it perfectly sincere, either because anarchy had been subdued, or because petty local and domestic oppressions were kept under, or because new energy was infused into national policy. In our own country, the popular government, born of ex-tribal freedom, revived sooner than elsewhere. Protected by the insularity of its home, it managed to live, and thus the British Constitution became the one important exception to the tendency of the ages, and through its remote influence this tendency was reversed, and the movement to democracy began again. Nevertheless, even with us, though the king might be feared or disliked, the king's office never lost its popularity. The Commonwealth and the Protectorate were never for a moment in real favor with the nation. The true enthusiasm was reserved for the Restoration. Thus, from the reign of Augustus Caesar to the establishment of the United States, it was democracy which was always, as a rule, on the decline, nor was the decline arrested till the American federal government was founded, itself the offspring of the British Constitution. At this moment, democracy is receiving the same unqualified eulogy which was once poured on monarchy, and though in its modern shape it is the product of a whole series of accidents, it is regarded by some as propelled in a continuous progress by an irresistible force. Independently of the historical question, how the fashion of bowing profoundly before democracy grew up, it has to be considered how far the inverted monarchy, which bears this name, deserves the reverence paid to it. The great philosophical writer who had the best opinion of it was Jeremy Bentham. His authority had to do with the broad extension of the suffrage in most of the states of the American Union, and he was the intellectual father of the masculine school of English radicals which died out with Mr. Grote. He claimed for governments having the essential characteristics of democracy, that they were much more free than other governments from what he called sinister influences. He meant by a sinister influence, a motive leading a government to prefer the interest of small portions of a community to the interest of the whole. I certainly think that, with an all-important qualification to be mentioned presently, this credit was justly claimed for democracy by Bentham, and with especial justice in relation to the circumstances of his own time. During the most active period of his long life the French Revolution had stopped all progress, and amid the relaxation of public watchfulness which followed, all sorts of small interests had found themselves niches in the English budget, like the robber barons of medieval Italy and Germany on every precipitous hill. Bentham thought it natural that they should do this. The lords of life, he said, are pleasure and pain. Every man follows his own interest as he understands it, and the part of the community which has political power will use it for its own objects. The remedy is to transfer political power to the entire community. It is impossible that they should abuse it, for the interest which they will try to promote is the interest of all, and the interest of all is the proper end and object of all legislation. On this apparently irresistible reasoning, one or two remarks have to be made. In the first place, the praise here claimed for democracy is shared by it with monarchy, particularly in its most absolute forms. There is no doubt that the Roman emperor cared more for the general good of the vast group of societies subject to him, than the aristocratic Roman Republic had done. The popularity of the great kings who broke up European feudalism, arose from their showing to all their vassals a far more even impartiality than could be obtained from petty feudal rulers, and in our own day, vague and shadowy as are the recommendations of what is called a nationality, a state founded on this principle has generally one real practical advantage through its obliteration of small tyrannies and local oppressions. It has further to be observed, that a very serious weakness in Bentham's argument has been disclosed by the experience of half a century, an experience which might be carried much farther back with the help of that historical inquiry which Bentham neglected and perhaps despised. Democratic governments no doubt attempt to legislate and administer in the interests of democracy, provided only the words are taken to mean the interests which democracy supposes to be its own. For purposes of actual government, the standard of interest is not any which Bentham would have approved, but merely popular opinion. Nobody would have acknowledged this more readily than Bentham, if his marvelously long life could have been prolonged to this day. He was the ancestor of the advanced liberals or radicals who now carry everything before them. All their favorite political machinery came from his intellectual workshop. Household suffrage, which he faintly preferred to universal suffrage, vote by ballot, and the short parliaments once in favor, received his energetic advocacy, and he detested the House of Lords. Yet there is no political writer whose strongest and most fundamental opinions are so directly at variance with the radical ideas of the moment. One has only to turn over his pages for abundant evidence of this assertion. Over and over again, you come upon demonstration that all the mechanism of human society depends on the satisfaction of reasonable expectations, and therefore on the strict maintenance of proprietary right, and the inviolability of contract. You find earnest cautions against the hasty acquisition of private property by the state for public advantage, and vehement protests against the removal of abuses without full compensation to those interested in them. Amid his denunciation of these capital vices of the legislator, it is amusing to read his outbreaks of enthusiasm for the enclosure of commons, now sometimes described as stealing the inheritance of the poor. The very vices of political argument which he was thought to have disposed of forever have gained a new vitality among the political school he founded. The anarchical sophisms which he exposed have migrated from France to England, and may be read in the literature of advanced liberalism side by side with the parliamentary fallacies which he laughed at in the debates of a Tory House of Commons. The name of Jeremy Bentham, one of the few who have wholly lived for what they held to be the good of the human race, has become even among educated men a byword for what is called his low view of human nature. The fact is that, under its most important aspect, he greatly overrated human nature. He overestimated its intelligence. He wrongly supposed that the truths which he saw, clearly cut and distinct, in the dry light of his intellect, could be seen by all other men or by many of them. He did not understand that they were visible only to the few, to the intellectual aristocracy. His delusion was the greater from his inattention to facts which lay little beyond the sphere of his vision. Knowing little of history, and caring little for it, he neglected one easy method of assuring himself of the extreme falseness of the conceptions of their interest, which a multitude of men may entertain. The world, said Machiavelli, is made up of the vulgar. Thus Bentham's fundamental proposition turns against himself. It is that, if you place power in men's hands, they will use it for their interest. Applying the rule to the whole of a political community, we ought to have a perfect system of government, but, taking it in connection with the fact that multitudes include too much ignorance to be capable of understanding their interest, it furnishes the principal argument against democracy. The immunity from sinister influences, the freedom from temptation to prefer the smaller interest to the greater, which Bentham claimed for democracy, should thus have been extended by him to the more absolute forms of monarchy. If indeed this suggestion had been made to him, he would probably have replied that monarchy has a tendency to show unjust favors to the military, the official, and the courtly classes, the classes nearest to itself. Monarchy, however, had had a very long history in Bentham's day, and democracy a very short one, and it is only as the political history of the American Union has developed itself, that we are able to detect in wide popular governments the same infirmities that characterize the kingly governments, of which they are the inverted reproductions. Under the shelter of one government as of the other, all sorts of selfish interests breed and multiply, speculating on its weaknesses and pretending to be its servants, agents, and delegates. Nevertheless, after making all due qualifications, I do not at all deny to democracies some portion of the advantage which so masculine a thinker as Bentham claimed for them. But, putting this advantage at the highest, it is more than compensated by one great disadvantage. Of all the forms of government, democracy is by far the most difficult. Little as the governing multitude is conscious of this difficulty, prone as the masses are to aggravate it by their avidity for taking more and more powers into their direct management, it is a fact which experience has placed beyond all dispute. It is the difficulty of democratic government that mainly accounts for its ephemeral duration. The greatest, most permanent, and most fundamental of all the difficulties of democracy, lies deep in the constitution of human nature. Democracy is a form of government, and in all governments acts of state are determined by an exertion of will. But in what sense can a multitude exercise volition? The student of politics can put to himself no more pertinent question than this. No doubt the vulgar opinion is, that the multitude makes up its mind as the individual makes up his mind, the demos determines like the monarch. A host of popular phrases testify to this belief. The will of the people, public opinion, the sovereign pleasure of the nation. Vox populi, vox Dei, belong to this class, which indeed constitutes a great part of the common stock of the platform and the press. But what do such expressions mean? They must mean that a great number of people, on a great number of questions, can come to an identical conclusion, and found an identical determination upon it. But this is manifestly true only of the simplest questions. A very slight addition of difficulty at once sensibly diminishes the chance of agreement, and, if the difficulty be considerable, an identical opinion can only be reached by trained minds assisting themselves by demonstration more or less rigorous. On the complex questions of politics, which are calculated in themselves to task to the utmost all the powers of the strongest minds, but are in fact vaguely conceived, vaguely stated, dealt with for the most part in the most haphazard manner by the most experienced statesmen, the common determination of a multitude is a chimerical assumption, and indeed, if it were really possible to extract an opinion upon them from a great mass of men, and to shape the administrative and legislative acts of a state upon this opinion as a sovereign command, it is probable that the most ruinous blunders would be committed, and all social progress would be arrested. The truth is, that the modern enthusiasts for democracy make one fundamental confusion. They mix up the theory, that the demos is capable of volition, with the fact, that it is capable of adopting the opinions of one man or of a limited number of men, and of founding directions to its instruments upon them. The fact, that what is called the will of the people really consists in their adopting the opinion of one person or a few persons, admits of a very convincing illustration from experience. Popular government and popular justice were originally the same thing. The ancient democracies devoted much more time and attention to the exercise of civil and criminal jurisdiction than to the administration of their public affairs, and, as a matter of fact, popular justice has lasted longer, has had a more continuous history, and has received much more observation and cultivation, than popular government. Over much of the world it gave way to royal justice, which was of at least equal antiquity, but it did not give way as universally or as completely as popular government did to monarchy. We have in England a relic of the ancient popular justice in the functions of the jury. The jury, technically known as the country, is the old adjudicating democracy, limited, modified, and improved, in accordance with the principles suggested by the experience of centuries, so as to bring it into harmony with modern ideas of judicial efficiency. The change which has had to be made in it is in the highest degree instructive. The jurors are 12, instead of a multitude. Their main business is to say aye or no on questions which are doubtless important, but which turn on facts arising in the transactions of everyday life. In order that they may reach a conclusion, they are assisted by a system of contrivances and rules of the highest artificiality and elaboration. An expert presides over their investigations. The judge, the representative of the rival and royal justice, and an entire literature is concerned with the conditions under which evidence on the facts in dispute may be laid before them. There is a rigid exclusion of all testimony which has a tendency to bias them unfairly. They are addressed, as of old, by the litigants or their advocates, but their inquiry concludes with a security unknown to antiquity, the summing up of the expert president, who is bound by all the rules of his profession to the sternest impartiality. If he errs, or if they flagrantly err, the proceedings may be quashed by a superior court of experts. Such is popular justice, after ages of cultivation. Now it happens that the oldest Greek poet has left us a picture, certainly copied from reality, of what popular justice was in its infancy. The primitive court is sitting, the question is guilty or not guilty. The old men of the community give their opinions in turn, the adjudicating democracy, the commons standing round about, applaud the opinion which strikes them most, and the applause determines the decision. The popular justice of the ancient republics was essentially of the same character. The adjudicating democracy simply followed the opinion which most impressed them in the speech of the advocate or litigant. Nor is it in the least doubtful that, but for the sternly repressive authority of the presiding judge, the modern English jury would, in the majority of cases, blindly surrender its verdict to the persuasiveness of one or other of the counsel who have been retained to address it. A modern governing democracy is the old adjudicating democracy very slightly changed. It cannot indeed be said that no attempt has been made to introduce into the multitudinous government modifications resembling those which have turned the multitudinous tribunal into the jury, for a variety of expedients for mitigating the difficulty of popular government have been invented and applied in England and the United States. But in our day a movement appears to have very distinctly set in towards unmodified democracy, the government of a great multitude of men striving to take the bulk of their own public affairs into their own hands. Such a government can only decide the questions submitted to it, as the old popular courts of justice decided them, by applauding somebody who speaks to it. The ruling multitude will only form an opinion by following the opinion of somebody. It may be of a great party leader, it may be of a small local politician, it may be of an organized association, it may be of an impersonal newspaper. The process of deciding in accordance with plausibilities, in the strict sense of this last word, goes on over an enormous area, growing ever more confused and capricious, and giving results even more ambiguous or inarticulate, as the numbers to be consulted are multiplied. The most interesting, and on the whole the most successful, experiments in popular government, are those which have frankly recognized the difficulty under which it labors. At the head of these we must place the virtually English discovery of government by representation, which caused parliamentary institutions to be preserved in these islands from the destruction which overtook them everywhere else, and to devolve as an inheritance upon the United States. Under this system, when it was in its prime, an electoral body, never in this country extraordinarily large, chose a number of persons to represent it in Parliament, leaving them unfettered by express instructions, but having with them at most a general understanding, that they would strive to give a particular direction to public policy. The effect was to diminish the difficulties of popular government, in exact proportion to the diminution in the number of persons who had to decide public questions. But this famous system is evidently in decay, through the ascendancy over it which is being gradually obtained by the vulgar assumption that great masses of men can directly decide all necessary questions for themselves. The agency, by which the representative is sought to be turned into the mere mouthpiece of opinions collected in the locality which sent him to the House of Commons, is, we need hardly say, that which is generally supposed to have been introduced from the United States under the name of the caucus, but which had very possibly a domestic exemplar in the ecclesiastical organization of the Wesleyan Methodists. The old Italian toxicologists are said to have always arranged their discoveries in a series of 3 terms: first the poison, next the antidote, thirdly the drug which neutralized the antidote. The antidote to the fundamental infirmities of democracy was representation, but the drug which defeats it has now been found in the caucus. And, by an unhappy mischance, the rapid conversion of the unfettered representative into the instructed delegate has occurred just at the time when the House of Commons itself is beginning to feel the inevitable difficulties produced by its numerousness. Jeremy Bentham used to denounce the non-attendance of members of Parliament at all sittings as a grave abuse, but it now appears that the scanty attendance of members, and the still scantier participation of most of them in debate, were essential to the conduct of business by the House of Commons, which was then, as it is still, the most numerous deliberative assembly in the world. The obstruction spoken of by politicians of experience with lamentation and surprise is nothing more than a symptom of the familiar disease of large governing bodies. It arises from the numbers of the House of Commons, and from the variety of opinions struggling in it for utterance. The remedies hitherto tried for the cure of obstruction will prove, in my judgment, to be merely palliatives. No multitudinous assembly which seeks really to govern can possibly be free from it, and it will probably lead to a constitutional revolution, the House of Commons abandoning the greatest part of its legislative authority to a cabinet of executive ministers. Another experiment, which, like the system of representation, is founded on the acknowledgement of fundamental difficulties, has been attempted several times in our generation, though not in our country. In one of its forms it has been known as the plebiscite. A question, or a series of questions, is simplified as much as possible, and the entire enfranchised portion of the community is asked to say aye or no to it. The zealots of democracy are beginning to forget, or conveniently to put aside, the enormous majorities by which the French nation, now supposed to be governing itself as a democracy, gave only the other day to a military despot any answer which he desired, but it may be conceded to them that the question put to the voters was not honestly framed, however much it was simplified in form. Whether Louis Napoleon Bonaparte should be president for life with large legislative powers? Whether he should be an hereditary emperor? Whether he should be allowed to divest himself of a portion of the authority he had assumed? Were not simple, but highly complex questions, incapable of being replied to by a naked yes or no. But the principle of the plebiscite has been engrafted on the Swiss federal constitution, and in some of the cantonal constitutions the referendum, as it is called, had existed from an earlier date. Here there is no ground for a charge of dishonesty. A new law is first thoroughly debated, voted upon, and amended, by the legislature, and the debates are carried by the newspapers to every corner of Swiss territory. But it does not come at once into force. If a certain number of citizens so desire, the entire electoral body is called upon to say aye or no to the question whether the law shall become operative. I do not undertake to say that the expedient has failed, but it can only be considered thoroughly successful by those who wish that there should be as little legislation as possible. Contrary to all expectations, to the bitter disappointment of the authors of the referendum, laws of the highest importance, some of them openly framed for popularity, have been vetoed by the people after they had been adopted by the federal or cantonal legislature. This result is sufficiently intelligible. It is possible, by agitation and exhortation, to produce in the mind of the average citizen a vague impression that he desires a particular change. But, when the agitation has settled down on the dregs, when the excitement has died away, when the subject has been threshed out, when the law is before him with all its detail, he is sure to find in it much that is likely to disturb his habits, his ideas, his prejudices, or his interests, and so, in the long run, he votes no to every proposal. The delusion that democracy, when it has once had all things put under its feet, is a progressive form of government, lies deep in the convictions of a particular political school, but there can be no delusion grosser. It receives no countenance either from experience or from probability. Englishmen in the East come into contact with vast populations of high natural intelligence, to which the very notion of innovation is loathsome, and the very fact that such populations exist should suggest that the true difference between the East and the West lies merely in this, that in Western countries there is a larger minority of exceptional persons who, for good reasons or bad, have a real desire for change. All that has made England famous, and all that has made England wealthy, has been the work of minorities, sometimes very small ones. It seems to me quite certain that, if for 4 centuries there had been a very widely extended franchise and a very large electoral body in this country, there would have been no reformation of religion, no change of dynasty, no toleration of dissent, not even an accurate calendar. The threshing machine, the power loom, the spinning jenny, and possibly the steam engine, would have been prohibited. Even in our day, vaccination is in the utmost danger, and we may say generally that the gradual establishment of the masses in power is of the blackest omen for all legislation founded on scientific opinion, which requires tension of mind to understand it and self-denial to submit to it. The truth is, that the inherent difficulties of democratic government are so manifold and enormous that, in large and complex modern societies, it could neither last nor work if it were not aided by certain forces which are not exclusively associated with it, but of which it greatly stimulates the energy. Of these forces, the one to which it owes most is unquestionably party. No force acting on mankind has been less carefully examined than party, and yet none better deserves examination. The difficulty which Englishmen in particular feel about it is very like that which men once experienced when they were told that the air had weight. It enveloped them so evenly and pressed on them so equally, that the assertion seemed incredible. Nevertheless, it is not hard to show that party and party government are very extraordinary things. Let us suppose it to be still the fashion to write the apologues so dear to the last century, in which some stranger from the East or West, some Persian full of intelligent curiosity, some Huron still unspoilt by civilization, or some unprejudiced bonds from India or China, describe the beliefs and usages of European countries, just as they struck him, to his kinsmen at the other end of the world. Let us assume that in one of these trifles, by a Voltaire or a Montesquieu, the traveler gave an account of a cultivated and powerful European commonwealth, in which the system of government consisted in half the cleverest men in the country taking the utmost pains to prevent the other half from governing. Or let us imagine some modern writer, with the unflinching perspicacity of a Machiavelli, analyzing the great party hero, leader or agitator as the famous Italian analyzed the personage equally interesting and important in his day, the tyrant or prince. Like Machiavelli, he would not stop to praise or condemn on ethical grounds, he would follow the real truth of things rather than an imaginary view of them. Many party heroes, he would say, have been imagined, who were never seen or known to exist in reality. But he would describe them as they really were. Allowing them every sort of private virtue, he would deny that their virtues had any effect on their public conduct, except so far as they helped to make men believe their public conduct virtuous. But this public conduct he would find to be not so much immoral as non-moral. He would infer, from actual observation, that the party hero was debarred by his position from the full practice of the great virtues of veracity, justice, and moral intrepidity. He could seldom tell the full truth, he could never be fair to persons other than his followers and associates, he could rarely be bold except in the interests of his faction. The picture drawn by him would be one which few living men would deny to be correct, though they might excuse its occurrence in nature on the score of moral necessity. And then, a century or two later, when democracies were as much forgotten as the Italian princedoms, our modern Machiavelli would perhaps be infamous and his work a proverb of immorality. Party has many strong affinities with religion. Its devotees, like those of a religious creed, are apt to substitute the fiction that they have adopted it upon mature deliberation for the fact that they were born into it or stumbled into it. But they are in the highest degree reluctant to come to an open breach with it, they count it shame to speak of its weak points, except to coreligionists, and, whenever it is in serious difficulty, they return to its assistance or rescue. Their relation to those outside the pale, the relation of Whig to Tory, of conservative to liberal, is on the whole exceedingly like that of Jew to Samaritan. But the closest resemblances are between party discipline and military discipline, and indeed, historically speaking, party is probably nothing more than a survival and a consequence of the primitive combativeness of mankind. It is war without the city transmuted into war within the city, but mitigated in the process. The best historical justification which can be offered for it is that it has often enabled portions of the nation, who would otherwise be armed enemies, to be only factions. Party strife, like strife in arms, develops many high but imperfect and one-sided virtues. It is fruitful of self-denial and self-sacrifice. But wherever it prevails, a great part of ordinary morality is unquestionably suspended, a number of maxims are received, which are not those of religion or ethics, and men do acts which, except as between enemies, and except as between political opponents, would be very generally classed as either immoralities or sins. Party disputes were originally the occupation of aristocracies, which joined in them because they loved the sport for its own sake, and the rest of the community followed one side or the other as its clients. Nowadays, party has become a force acting with vast energy on multitudinous democracies, and a number of artificial contrivances have been invented for facilitating and stimulating its action. Yet, in a democracy, the fragment of political power falling to each man's share is so extremely small, that it would be hardly possible, with all the aid of the caucus, the stump, and the campaign newspaper, to rouse the interests of thousands or millions of men, if party were not coupled with another political force. This, to speak plainly, is corruption. A story is current respecting a conversation of the great American, Alexander Hamilton, with a friend who expressed wonder at Hamilton's extreme admiration of so corrupt a system as that covered by the name of the British Constitution. Hamilton is said to have, in reply, expressed his belief that when the corruption came to an end the Constitution would fall to pieces. The corruption referred to was that which had been openly practiced by the Whig ministers of George I and George II. Through the bestowal of places and the payment of sums of money, but which in the reign of George III had died down to an obscurer set of malpractices, ill understood, but partially explained by the constant indebtedness of the thrifty king. Hamilton of course meant that, amid the many difficulties of popular government, he doubted whether, in its English form, it could be carried on, unless support were purchased by governments, and this opinion might very plausibly have been held concerning the early governments of the Hanoverian dynasty, so deeply unpopular did the revolution settlement soon become with large classes of Englishmen. What put an end to this corruption was in reality not an English but a French phenomenon. The revolution begun in 1789, which, through the violent repulsion with which it inspired the greatest part of the nation, and the half-avowed attraction which it had for the residue, supplied the English parties with principles of action which did not need the cooperation of any corrupt inducement to partisanship. The corruption which we find denounced by Bentham after the close of the Great War was not bribery, but vested interest, nor did the old practices ever revive in England in their ancient shape. Votes at elections continued to be bought and sold, but not votes in Parliament. Whether Hamilton looked forward to an era of purity in his own country, cannot be certainly known. He and his coadjutors undoubtedly were unprepared for the rapid development of party which soon set in. They evidently thought that their country would be poor, and they probably expected to see all evil influences defeated by the elaborate contrivances of the federal constitution. But the United States became rapidly wealthy and rapidly populous, and the universal suffrage of all white men, native-born or immigrant, was soon established by the legislation of the most powerful states. With wealth, population, and widely diffused electoral power, corruption sprang into vigorous life. President Andrew Jackson, proclaiming the principle of to the victors the spoils, which all parties soon adopted, expelled from office all administrative servants of the United States who did not belong to his faction, and the crowd of persons filling these offices, which are necessarily very numerous in so vast a territory, together with the groups of wealthy men interested in public lands and in the countless industries protected by the customs tariff, formed an extensive body of contributors from whom great amounts of money were levied by a species of taxation, to be presently expended in wholesale bribery. A reaction against this system carried the present President of the United States into office, but the opinion of almost all the politicians who the other day supported Mr. Elaine bore probably the closest resemblance to Hamilton's opinion about Great Britain. They were persuaded that the American party system cannot continue without corruption. It is impossible to lay down M. Scherer's pamphlet without a conviction that the same opinion is held of France by the public men who direct the public affairs of the French Republic. The account which this writer gives of the expedients by which all French governments have sought to secure support, since the resignation of Marshal MacMahon, is most deplorable. There is a scale of public corruption, with an excessive and extravagant scheme of public works at one end of it, and at the other the open barter of votes by the electoral committees for the innumerable small places in the gift of the highly centralized French administration. The principle that the spoils belong to the victors has been borrowed from the United States, and receives a thoroughgoing application. Every branch of the public service, even since M. Scherer wrote, the judicial bench has been completely purged of functionaries not professing allegiance to the party in power for the time being. We Englishmen, alone among popularly governed communities, have tried an expedient peculiar to ourselves. We have handed over all patronage to the Civil Service Commissioners, and we have adopted the Corrupt Practices Act. It is a most singular fact, that the only influences having an affinity for the old corruption, which still survive in Great Britain, are such as can be brought to bear on those exalted regions of society, in which stars, garters, ribbons, titles, and lord lieutenancies, still circulate. What will be the effect on British government of the heroic remedies we have administered to ourselves, has yet to be seen. What will come of borrowing the caucus from the United States, and refusing to soil our fingers with the oil used in its native country to lubricate the wheels of the machine? Perhaps we are not at liberty to forget that there are two kinds of bribery. It can be carried on by promising or giving to expectant partisans places paid out of the taxes, or it may consist in the directer process of legislating away the property of one class and transferring it to another. It is this last which is likely to be the corruption of these latter days. Party and corruption, as influences which have shown themselves capable of bringing masses of men under civil discipline, are probably as old as the very beginning of political life. The savage ferocity of party strife in the Greek states has been described by the great Greek historian in some of his most impressive sentences, and nothing in modern times has approached the proportions of the corruption practiced at the elections of the Roman Republic, in spite of all the impediments placed in its way by an earlier form of the ballot. But in quite recent times a third expedient has been discovered for producing, not indeed agreement, but the semblance of agreement, in a multitude of men. This is generalization, the trick of rapidly framing, and confidently uttering, general propositions on political subjects. It was once supposed that the power of appreciating general propositions was especially characteristic of the highest minds, which it distinguished from those of a vulgar stamp always immersed in detail and in particulars. Once or twice, indeed, in the course of their intellectual history, mankind have fallen on their knees to worship generalization, and indeed, without help from it, it is probable that the strongest intellect would not be able to bear the ever-accumulating burden of particular facts. But, in these latter days, A ready belief in generalities has shown itself to be a characteristic, not indeed of wholly uneducated, but of imperfectly educated minds. Meantime, men ambitious of political authority have found out the secret of manufacturing generalities in any number. Nothing can be simpler. All generalization is the product of abstraction. All abstraction consists in dropping out of sight a certain number of particular facts, and constructing a formula which will embrace the remainder, and the comparative value of general propositions turns entirely on the relative importance of the particular facts selected and of the particular facts rejected. The modern facility of generalization is obtained by a curious precipitation and carelessness in this selection and rejection, which, when properly carried out, is the only difficult part of the entire process. General formulas, which can be seen on examination to have been arrived at by attending only to particulars few, trivial, or irrelevant, are turned out in as much profusion as if they dropped from an intellectual machine, and debates in the House of Commons may be constantly read, which consisted wholly in the exchange of weak generalities and strong personalities. On a pure democracy, this class of general formulas has a prodigious effect. Crowds of men can be got to assent to general statements, clothed in striking language, but unverified and perhaps incapable of verification. And thus there is formed a sort of sham and pretense of concurrent opinion. There has been a loose acquiescence in a vague proposition, and then the people, whose voice is the voice of God, is assumed to have spoken. Useful as it is to democracies, this levity of assent is one of the most enervating of national habits of mind. It has seriously enfeebled the French intellect. It is most injuriously affecting the mind of England. It threatens little short of ruin to the awakening intellect of India, where political abstractions, founded exclusively upon English facts, and even here requiring qualification, are applied by the educated minority, and by their newspapers, to a society which, through 9/10 of its structure, belongs to the 13th century of the West. The points which I have attempted to establish are these. Without denying to democratic governments some of the advantages which were claimed for them by the one thinker of the first order who has held democracy to be in itself a good form of government, I have pointed out that it has the signal disadvantage of being the most difficult of all governments, and that the principal influences by which this difficulty has hitherto been mitigated are injurious either to the morality or to the intellect of the governing multitude. If the government of the many be really inevitable, one would have thought that the possibility of discovering some other and newer means of enabling it to fulfill the ends for which all governments exist, would have been a question exercising all the highest powers of the strongest minds, particularly in the community which, through the success of its popular institutions, has paved the way for all modern democracy. Yet hardly anything worth mentioning has been produced on the subject in England or on the continent. I ought, however, to notice a series of discussions which have long been going on in the little state of Belgium, ending in a remarkable experiment. Alarmed by a reckless agitation for universal suffrage, the best heads in the country have devised an electoral law, which is worthy of the most respectful attention. Under its provisions, an attempt is made to attach the franchise, not only to property, but to prove capacity in all its manifestations, to confer it not simply on the men who contribute a certain amount to the revenue, but on every man who has taken honors at a high school or at college, on everybody who can pass an examination with credit, on every foreman of a workshop or factory. The idea is to confer power not on the many, but on the strongest among the many. The experiment, however, is at present confined to provincial and communal elections, and we have yet to see whether an electoral system, which would be attended by peculiar difficulties in England, can be successfully carried out even in Belgium. On the whole, there is only one country in which the question of the safest and most workable form of democratic government has been adequately discussed, and the results of discussion tested by experiment. This is the United States of America. American experience has, I think, shown that, by wise constitutional provisions thoroughly thought out beforehand, democracy may be made tolerable. The public powers are carefully defined, the mode in which they are to be exercised is fixed, and the amplest securities are taken that none of the more important constitutional arrangements shall be altered without every guarantee of caution and every opportunity for deliberation. The expedient is not conclusive, for the Americans, settled in a country of boundless unexhausted wealth, have never been tempted to engage in socialistic legislation, but, as far as it has gone, a large measure of success cannot be denied to it, success which has all but dispelled the old ill fame of democracies. The short history of the United States has, at the same time, established one momentous negative conclusion. When a democracy governs, it is not safe to leave unsettled any important question concerning the exercise of public powers. I might give many instances of this, but the most conclusive is the War of Secession, which was entirely owing to the omission of the fathers to provide beforehand for the solution of certain constitutional problems, lest they should stir the topic of Negro slavery. It would seem that, by a wise constitution, democracy may be made nearly as calm as water in a great artificial reservoir, but if there is a weak point anywhere in the structure, the mighty force which it controls will burst through it and spread destruction far and near. This warning deserves all the attention of Englishmen. They are opening the way to democracy on all sides. Let them take heed that it be not admitted into a receptacle of loose earth and sand. And, in laying this caution to heart, it would be well for them to consider what sort of a constitution it is to which they must trust for the limitation of the powers, and the neutralization of the weaknesses, of the 2 or 3 millions of voters who have been admitted to the suffrage, in addition to the multitude enfranchised in 1867. The events of the summer and autumn of 1884 were not reassuring. During all that time, the air was hot and thick with passionate assertions of contradictory opinions. The points on which the controversy turned were points in the construction of the Constitution, and the fact that the ablest men in the country took sides upon them proves them to be unsettled. Nor does there exist any acknowledged authority by which they can be adjudicated upon and decided. It is useless to appeal to the law, for the very charge against the House of Lords was, that the law had been put abusively into operation. It is useless to allege the authority of the electoral body, for the very charge against the House of Commons was, that it did not represent the constituencies. To describe such a dispute as serious, is hardly to do it justice, but, in order to bring into full light the scope and number of the doubtful questions which it proved to exist, I will mention in turn the principal depositaries of public authority in this country: the Crown, the Cabinet, the House of Lords, and the House of Commons, and I will note the various opinions which appear to be held as to the part which each of them should take in legislation by which the structure of the Constitution is altered. The powers over legislation which the law recognizes in the Crown are its power to veto bills which have passed both the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and its power to dissolve Parliament. The first of these powers has probably been lost through disuse. There is, not, at the same time, the smallest reason for supposing that it was abandoned through any inconsistency with popular government. It was not employed, because there was no occasion for employing it. The reigns of the first Hanoverian sovereigns were periods of activity, high foreign policy, and the legislation of the time was utterly insignificant. The king's government was, moreover, steadily drawing to itself the initiative in legislation, and for more than a century the kings succeeded on the whole in governing through what ministers they pleased. As to the right to dissolve Parliament by an independent exercise of the royal will, it cannot be quite confidently asserted to have become obsolete. The question has been much discussed in the colonies which attempt to follow the British constitutional procedure, and it seems to be generally allowed that a representative of the Crown cannot be blamed for insisting on a dissolution of the legislature, though his ministers are opposed to it. It is probable, however, that in this country the object would be practically attained in a different way. The Crown would appoint ministers who were willing to take the not very serious risks involved in appealing to the constituencies. The latest precedent in this case is quite modern. William IV, Her Majesty's uncle and immediate predecessor, replaced Lord Melbourne by Sir Robert Peel in 1834, and Sir Robert Peel, as he afterwards told the House of Commons, took upon himself the entire responsibility of dissolving Parliament. The Cabinet, which through a series of constitutional fictions has succeeded to all the powers of the Crown, has drawn to itself all, and more than all, of the royal power over legislation. It can dissolve Parliament, and, if it were to advise the Crown to veto a bill which has been passed through both houses, there is no certainty that the proceeding would be seriously objected to. That it can arrest a measure at any stage of its progress through either House of Parliament, is conceded on all hands, and indeed the exercise of this power was exemplified on the largest scale at the end of the session of 1884, when a large number of bills of the highest importance were abandoned in deference to a Cabinet decision. The Cabinet has further become the sole source of all important legislation, and therefore, by the necessity of the case, of all constitutional legislation, and as a measure amending the Constitution passes through the House of Commons, the modification or maintenance of its details depends entirely on the fiat of the ministers of the day. Although the Cabinet, as such, is quite unknown to the law, it is manifestly the English institution which is ever more and more growing in authority and influence, and already, besides wielding more than the legislative powers of the Crown, it has taken to itself nearly all the legislative powers of Parliament, depriving it in particular of the whole right of initiation. The long familiarity of Englishmen with this institution, and with the copies of it made in the European countries which possess constitutions, has blinded them to its extreme singularity. There is a fashion among historians of expressing wonder, not unmixed with dislike, at the secret bodies and councils which they occasionally find invested with authority in famous states. In ancient history, the Spartan ephors; in modern history, the Venetian Council of Ten are criticized in this spirit. Many of these writers are Englishmen, and yet they seem quite unconscious that their own country is governed by a secret council. There can be very little doubt that the secrecy of the Cabinet is its strength. Footnote: no secret has been better kept than that of English Cabinet procedure. Apart from Cabinet ministers, past and present, there are probably not a dozen men in the country who know accurately how cabinets conduct their deliberations, and how they arrive at a conclusion. Some information may, however, be obtained from the published diaries of the second Lord Ellenborough, from some printed, but unpublished, memoirs left by Lord Broughton, Sir J. Cam Hobhouse, and in some degree from Lord Malmesbury's recent memoirs of an ex-minister. A great part of the weakness of democracy springs from publicity of discussion, and nobody who has had any share in public business can have failed to observe that the chances of agreement among even a small number of persons increase in nearly exact proportion to the chances of privacy. If the growth in power of the cabinet is checked, it will probably be from causes of very recent origin. It is essentially a committee of the men who lead the party which has a majority in the House of Commons. But there are signs that its authority over its party is passing to other committees, selected less for eminence in debate and administration than for the adroit management of local political business. The House of Lords, as a matter of strict law, has the right to reject or amend any measure which is submitted to it, nor has this legal right in either of its forms been disused or abandoned, save as regards money bills. But it has lately become evident that, when the right is exerted over measures amending the Constitution, strong differences of opinion exist as to the mode and conditions of its exercise, and, as is not uncommon in this country, it is very difficult to gather from the violent language of the disputants, whether they contend that the law should be altered, or that the exertion of power with which they are quarreling is forbidden by usage, precedent, conventional understanding, or mere expediency. The varieties of doctrine are many and wide apart. On the one hand, one extreme party compares the rejection of a bill by the House of Lords to the veto of a bill by the Crown, and insists that the first power should be abandoned as completely as the last is believed to have been. Conversely, the most influential members of the House of Lords allow that it would act improperly in rejecting a constitutional measure, of which the electoral body has signified its approval by the result of a general election. Between these positions there appear to be several intermediate opinions, most of them, however, stated in language of the utmost uncertainty and vagueness. Some persons appear to think that the House of Lords ought not to reject or postpone a constitutional measure which affects the powers of the House of Commons, or its relation to the constituencies, or the constituencies themselves. Others seem to consider that the power of rejection might be exercised on such a measure, if the majority by which it has passed the House of Commons is small, but not if it exceeds a certain number. Lastly, little can be extracted from the language of a certain number of controversialists, violent as it is, except an opinion that the House of Lords ought not to do wrong, and that it did wrong on one particular occasion. The power of the House of Commons over legislation, including constitutional legislation, might seem at first sight to be complete and unqualified. Nevertheless, as I have pointed out, it some time ago surrendered the initiative in legislation, and it is now more and more surrendering the conduct of it, to the so-called ministers of the Crown. It may further be observed from the language of those who, on the whole, contend for the widest extension of its powers, that a new theory has made its appearance, which raises a number of embarrassing questions as to the authority of the House of Commons in constitutional legislation. This is the theory of the mandate. It seems to be conceded that the electoral body must supply the House of Commons with a mandate to alter the Constitution. It has been asserted that a mandate to introduce household suffrage into the counties was given to the House of Commons elected in 1880, but not a mandate to confer the suffrage on women. What is a mandate? As used here, the word has not the meaning which belongs to it in English, French, or Latin. I conjecture that it is a fragment of a French phrase, mandat imperatif, which means an express direction from a constituency which its representative is not permitted to disobey, and I imagine the mutilation to imply that the direction may be given in some loose and general manner. But in what manner? Is it meant that, if a candidate in an election address declares that he is in favor of household suffrage or women's suffrage, and is afterwards elected, he has a mandate to vote for it, but not otherwise? And, if so, how many election addresses, containing such references, and how many returns, constitute a mandate to the entire House of Commons? Again, assuming the mandate to have been obtained, how long is it in force? The House of Commons may sit for 7 years under the Septennial Act, but the strict law has hardly ever prevailed, and in the great majority of cases the House of Commons has not lasted for nearly the whole period. May it give effect to its mandate in its 4th, or 5th, or 6th session, or must an alteration of the Constitution be the earliest measure to which a Parliament commissioned to deal with it must address itself? These unsettled questions formed the staple of the controversy which raged among us for months, but the prominence which they obtained is not in the very least arbitrary or accidental. The question of the amount and nature of the notice which the electoral body shall receive of an intended change in the Constitution, the question whether anything like a mandate shall be given by that body to the legislature, the question whether existing constituencies shall have full jurisdiction over proposed constitutional innovation, the question of the majority which shall be necessary for the decision of the legislature on a constitutional measure, all these questions belong to the very essence of constitutional doctrine. There is no one of them which is peculiar to this country. What is peculiar to this country is the extreme vagueness with which all of them are conceived and stated. The Americans of the United States, feeling on all sides the strongest pressure of democracy, but equipped with a remarkable wealth of constitutional knowledge inherited from their forefathers, have had to take up and solve every one of them. I will endeavor to show what have been their methods of solution. I will not at present go for an example to the Constitution of the United States, abounding as it does in the manifold restrictions thought necessary by its framers for the purpose of securing in a probably democratic society the self-command without which it could not become or remain a nation. It will be sufficient for my object to quote the provisions respecting the procedure to be followed on constitutional amendments, contained in the constitutions of individual states, which, I need not say, can only legislate within the limits permitted to them by the federal constitution. One of the subjects, however, on which the powers of the several states were till lately exclusive and are still most extensive, is the franchise, and this gives a peculiar value and interest to the provisions which I will proceed to extract from the Constitution of the great state of New York. Article 13 of the Constitution of New York, which is still in force, runs as follows. Any amendment or amendments to this Constitution may be proposed to the Senate and Assembly, and if the same be agreed to by a majority of the members elected to each of the two houses, such amendment or amendments shall be entered on their journals with the yeas and nays taken thereon, and referred to the legislature to be chosen at the next general election, and shall be published for 3 months previous to the time of making such choice, and if, in the legislature so next chosen as aforesaid, such proposed amendment or amendments shall be agreed to by a majority of all the members elected to each house, then it shall be the duty of the legislature to submit such proposed amendment or amendments to the people in such manner and at such time as the legislature shall prescribe, and if the people shall approve and ratify such amendment or amendments by a majority of the electors qualified to vote for members of the legislature voting thereon, such amendment or amendments shall become part of the Constitution. Section 2 of the article provides an alternative mode of amendment. At the general election to be held, in each 20th year, and also at such time as the legislature may by law provide, the question shall there be a convention to revise the Constitution and amend the same? Shall be decided by the electors qualified to vote for members of the legislature, and in case a majority of the electors so qualified voting at such election shall decide in favor of a convention for such purpose, the legislature at the next session shall provide by law for the election of delegates to such convention. These provisions of the Constitution of New York, regulating the procedure to be followed in constitutional amendments, and therefore in measures extending or altering the electoral franchise, are substantially repeated in the constitutions of nearly all the American states. Where there are variations, they are generally in the direction of greater stringency. The Constitution of Ohio, for example, requires that there shall be at the least a 3/5 majority in each branch of the legislature proposing an amendment, and a 2/3 majority is necessary if it is sought to summon a convention. When an amendment is proposed in Massachusetts, a 2/3 majority is demanded in the lower house, and the same majority must be obtained in both houses before the Constitution of Louisiana can be amended. The Constitution of New Jersey gives greater precision to the provision of the New York Constitution for the ultimate ratification of the proposed amendment by the constituencies, by inserting, after the words "the people shall ratify and approve," the words "at a special election to be held for that purpose only." The same Constitution declares that no amendment shall be submitted to the people more than once in 5 years, and, like the constitutions of several other states, it gives no power to summon a revising convention. No doubt therefore is possible as to the mode in which these American state constitutions settle the formidable questions which the discussion of 1884 has shown to be unsettled in this country. First of all, it is to be noted that the electoral body recognized by all the constitutions, without exception, as having an exclusive jurisdiction over amendments of the Constitution, is the existing electoral body, and not any electoral body of the future. Next, the most ample notice is given to it that an amendment of the Constitution will be brought before the next legislature which it is called upon to choose. Both branches of the outgoing legislature must record a resolution with the numbers of the division upon it, and this resolution must be published 3 months before a general election. It is quite clear, therefore, that the representatives chosen at this election will have what may be called a mandate. The amendment must then be agreed to by an absolute majority of the members of both houses of the new legislature, or, as is required in some states, by a 2/3 or 3/5 majority in both houses, or one of them. But there is a final security in addition. The mandate must be ratified. The amendment must be submitted to the people in any way which the legislature may provide, and, as is shown by the Constitution of New Jersey, the ratification is usually placed in the hands of a special legislature specially elected for the purpose of giving or refusing it. Such are the securities against surprise or haste in conducting the most important part of legislation, which American political sagacity has devised. They may very well suggest to the English politicians some serious reflections. What was most remarkable in the discussion of 12 months since was, far less the violent and inflammatory language in which it was carried on, than the extreme vagueness of the considerations upon which it has turned. The House of Lords, for instance, was threatened with extinction or mutilation for a certain offense. Yet when the offense is examined, it appears to have consisted in the violation of some rule or understanding, never expressed in writing, at variance with the strict law, and not perhaps construed in precisely the same way by any two thinking men in the country. Political history shows that men have at all times quarreled more fiercely about phrases and formulas, than even about material interests, and it would seem that the discussion of British constitutional legislation is distinguished from the discussion of all other legislation by having no fixed points to turn upon, and therefore by its irrational violence. Is it therefore idle to hope that at some calmer moment now that the creation of 2 or 3 million more voters has been accomplished we may borrow a few of the American securities against surprise and irreflection in constitutional legislation, and express them with something like the American precision? Is it always to be possible in this country that a great amendment of the Constitution should, first of all, be attempted to be carried by tumultuary meetings of the population, enfranchised and unenfranchised next, that it should be conducted through Parliament by a process which practically excluded Parliament from all share in shaping its provisions and, lastly, that it should hardly become law before it was hurriedly altered for the purpose of giving votes to a particular class of paupers? Some have supposed that the only remedy would be one which involved the conversion of the unwritten Constitution of Great Britain into a written Constitution. But a great part of our Constitution is already written. Many of the powers of the Crown, many of the powers of the House of Lords, including the whole of its judicial powers, much of the Constitution of the House of Commons and its entire relation to the electoral body have long since been defined by Act of Parliament. There does not seem to be any insuperable objection, first of all, to making a distinction between ordinary legislation and legislation which in any other country would be called constitutional, and next, to requiring for the last a special legislative procedure, intended to secure caution and deliberation, and as near an approach to impartiality as a system of party government will admit of. The alternative is to leave unsettled all the questions which the controversy of 1884 brought to light, and to give free play to a number of tendencies already actively at work. It is quite plain whither they are conducting us. We are drifting towards a type of government associated with terrible events, a single assembly, armed with full powers over the Constitution, which it may exercise at pleasure. It will be a theoretically all-powerful convention, governed by a practically all-powerful secret committee of public safety, but kept from complete submission to its authority by obstruction, for which its rulers are always seeking to find a remedy in some kind of moral guillotine.